Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gostola, and welcome to this week's edition of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm Kevin Gostola, one of the show's hosts, and I'm pleased to be joined by David McBride, who is a former military lawyer for the Royal Australia Regiment and Australia Special Forces. He was deployed to Afghanistan in the early 2010s. He's also a whistleblower who exposed war crimes and is facing prosecution in Australia. Thank you for joining, David.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
And to begin, why don't you introduce yourself just a little bit? But we'll have you introduce yourself in the context of the conflict in Afghanistan and describe how you came to be involved and deployed to Afghanistan, and describe your country. How did Australia come to be a part of this coalition that ultimately joined the invasion of Afghanistan?
I was born in Australia, but I spent a lot of my life in the UK. I went to Oxford University in England, and then I joined the British Army, and I was an officer in the British Army. I came back to Australia and I started practicing as a lawyer, and I got a job being a legal officer, what they call a legal officer, where it's a bit, you call them JAGs in America. And it's, you're an officer, you wear a uniform, but you're meant to make sure people comply with the rules of engagement. If people get into trouble, you're meant to make sure that the law is followed. I did 2 tours of Afghanistan as part of the Australian Army. As you said, in my first tour in 2011, I was concerned that we were lying. We were lying to the politicians, saying everything is going well, even though it clearly wasn't. And if you speak to most soldiers, they will say everybody knew it wasn't going well, but the idea was to put out false messages to say it was going well. And we'll talk about that later. I came back in 2013 for my second tour with the Special Forces, which do a lot more sort of direct action, which is attacking the enemy with missiles and going to their houses and killing them. And I could see that the false messaging was getting out of control. I came back to Australia. I made an internal complaint because I was still very much inside the tent. I was someone who believed in Western democracies. I believed that we basically were good people who occasionally did the wrong thing. And I started to sort of gently prod the organisation to say, we're getting carried away with false messaging. We're not following the law, and we're not even doing a good job. We're just trying to win the war by saying we're winning the war, even though we know we're not. And we've become very politicised in that we were really just an arm of the politicians, in that we would say whatever the politicians wanted us to say, which was, of course, good news. My complaint wasn't well received. I immediately came under scrutiny. I had a very good career up to that point, and then my career stalled. I was moved sideways. I was given a lot of psychological reviews. I was gaslit by the organisation, who said, it's all in your imagination. They sent me to a psychiatrist who said that I was nuts and that it was all a sense of my own entitlement. Eventually, after about 4 years of trying to get people to care, I found some media people who took the classified documents, which I think proved my case, and they made something called the Afghan files, which was quite a big story in Australia, which was one of the first stories to expose the war crimes and cover-ups and the fact that we weren't telling the truth about the war. It was obvious that they printed the actual documents, and the police came to call on me like a year later. I left the country and I went to Spain, and I was kind of on the run. And then, but I had a daughter still in Australia, and I decided to come back and face the music. And I came back to Australia in 2018, and I was arrested at the airport. And since then, I have been fighting a charge about, I'm similar to Julian Assange. It's an espionage charge, even though I'm a whistleblower. They're saying I damaged national security. The penalties are extremely strict. They're over 100 years in jail if they want to put me in jail. If they want to, apply the direct letter of the law. I'm very much treated as if I'm a terrorist. And the trial has been put on. I was charged in 2018, 2021. It's 3 years now since I was charged, and now the trial's been put off for another year. So I'm still facing trial. These latest events in Afghanistan have been very helpful to me, even though they're tragic for the people of Afghanistan, because it shows what I was saying all along, that we knew it was a debacle. Everybody knew. There was a culture of silence to cover it up. And the politicians were never really trying to win the war. I believe, as Julian Assange said, they just wanted to keep it going because it was a big money spinner for the corporations. It was a big money spinner for the political parties because the corporations would make donations to them. And it was a vote winner, dropping bombs on Islamic people in the mountains won a lot of votes of that section of the population that just likes that equates dropping bombs and shooting people up as strong leadership. Australia got into it. It's an interesting question. Australia's got a lot to answer for, and Britain, because the US cannot carry out these military adventures without some sort of allies. They don't need our troops. In fact, it was a bit of a joke because our military is so small that we have to have the Americans for us to go to war. We need their planes, we need their support to feed us, etc. But the Americans need us because they need to be able to say to the rest of the world, "Oh, it's not just the Americans being aggressive here. We've got Britain and Australia." And when we went to the Iraq War, for example, we didn't really go to the Iraq War in the sense we had a token presence. But it was important for the Americans because they were able to say, "Oh, look, there's this first world country who's a democracy and they're coming to the war with us. Therefore, it's not just us carrying out this adventure for self-interest." And the Australians and the Brits have a lot to answer for because they made it possible for the Americans to get away with things that they probably couldn't have got away from if it was just them on their own.
As we all have become familiar through the whistleblowing of NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, it's really the Five Eyes, right? Like the Australia being part of this group that the United States exploits and takes advantage of, and then in return, supposedly the Australian government, these other governments, are to have access to intelligence, are to be able to gain some kind of national security benefits to forming a relationship. But you're basically there to make it seem like the U.S. isn't going it alone in these imperial operations that are destined to fail and have little support from people worldwide. That coalition of the willing in Iraq, if you remember, with President George W. Bush, which I guess Australia technically would have been a part of that coalition in order to help make it seem that, Bush wasn't just pushing for regime change against Saddam Hussein all by America's own self. So what if, what's your view? Let's start from the present and we'll work our way backwards. What's your view of how everything has unraveled in the last month here? Let's say. Well, we'll say because that's really when I presume that the Taliban was on the move before that. But what's your sense of what happened? And as somebody who I presume has been following these events closely, what was it like to watch the Taliban move closer and closer to Kabul until that day, which was quite, I mean, to me, I have not seen anything like it in the media. It was as if like a terrorist attack had just happened. It wasn't on par of like the 9/11 attacks on New York City and the Pentagon in DC, but it was as if like, hundreds of Americans had just died when the Taliban took over Kabul. So, but I mean, what was it like for you to watch this unfold?
I think for most of the professional soldiers like myself, and I had probably more experience than anybody. And then I'd been to, unlike just about everybody else, I'd been to Afghanistan when the Taliban were in charge in 2000. And then I did 2 tours after that. So I knew a fair bit about the real Afghanistan. And I wasn't surprised at all. And anyone who was a professional soldier, because it was not a matter of it suddenly collapsing. It was never really, it was never any good, in the sense that it was a war run by PR. We were always were saying that it was going well and we were winning, and that the Afghan sort of force that we put in, the Afghan National Army, the collaborators really, that they were viable, but we all knew that they weren't. And we all knew that they were only there to get a temporary paycheck from the US government, from the US taxpayer. As soon as that stopped, and it hadn't even stopped, but as soon as they didn't have air cover and they weren't getting their paychecks, they were going to drop their weapons and run. It was a phony force from the beginning. There were some good soldiers, but they were in the minority, and we never had the moral high ground, in that despite the confronting nature of the 9/11 attacks, we didn't actually have the legal grounds to go to Afghanistan, push out the de facto government, put in a phony government without any legitimacy, and then claim it as a colony of the United States. It wasn't going to work, no matter how unpalatable the Taliban might be to Western sensibilities. They were the legitimate government. And by replacing them, they had some sort of support with the Afghan people. Not all, but enough. And we pushed them out. We put in these kind of phony puppets, and that was never acceptable. And the people that were fighting for us, you could see the big differences. And the people that fought for the Taliban, they fought like the Viet Cong. They fought for a bowl of rice and a few hours rest in your house, whereas the people that fought for us didn't get out of bed except for $1,000. They were mercenaries, really, and they didn't have any sense of fighting for their country. And there was no doubt it was going to collapse. It was a bit like the failed US corporation Enron. It wasn't so much a collapse at the final. It was a phony. It was a phony nation, a Potemkin village all along, and it was exposed at the end. But the thing that made me so angry is that it was phony for 20 years. And that we thought we would win the war by putting back false messages and saying how good it was. We never had popular support of most of the people. They hated us. They might have been scared of us, but they didn't like us. And we put out this popular message to say everybody hates the Taliban, everybody loves us, we're doing really well. But it was false from the start. And it was exposed at the end. And this is why I'm really glad to talk to you, because the blame game is going to start. And what I want to make sure is important, that they don't manage to pin the blame on a few Afghans, but to say we need to pin the blame on the American military leaders and the American politicians and the flunkies from Australia that just followed in lockstep, because they all knew it was phony. but they used it for their own purposes to win elections and to get through the next electoral news cycle. But it was always going to collapse because it was always a house of cards that cost $2 billion US taxpayer dollars, by the way. And one of the reasons they kept it going was because in many ways, it wasn't a loss for the military industrial complex. It was a win because that money, that taxpayer money, wasn't wasted as far as they're concerned. That taxpayer money went into the pockets of people like Dick Cheney and his cronies and McDonnell Douglas and all those kind of companies. They made enormous profits. They gave it back to their shareholders. They gave a lot of the profits to donations to the political parties. George W. Bush got re-elected with an increased majority in 2004. Barack Obama got two terms, and he definitely was, very hot on the wall. Trump only got one term, and he was one of the few people that said we need to end these endless wars, and it didn't go well for him. So they traded off it for politically, and they all benefited from it. And what I want to see is that there is accountability. Plenty of people benefited from the war. They did so with bad faith, and I want to make sure that someone is held to account.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're enjoying this week's episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. Here is a reminder to support our show and help us keep going. You can go to Patreon or Rockfin or Spotify to support our show. So here's the links. If you want to support us on Patreon, go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. If you want to support us on Rockfin and become a subscriber of our channel, go to rockfin.com/unauthorized dis. If you'd like to support us on Spotify, pull up our show, the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, and subscribe to our paid content. On all three spaces, you get access to full episodes and any other additional exclusive content we post every month. So thank you, and back to the show. So let me backtrack here, because when you were deployed, I can recognize from the timeline, when you were deployed to Afghanistan, it's pretty recent that President Barack Obama surged in Afghanistan, sending ultimately it was several. I think it was somewhere around what was like 70 or 80,000 additional troops to Afghanistan, something around there. I may not have that number correct, but I know it was tens of thousands of more troops that were deployed to Afghanistan ultimately. And, Biden's claimed that he disagreed with the number, but he really only was in favor of 10,000 less than Obama. So let's not let the world be entirely misled by his pronouncements from the podium or wherever he's speaking. But you were there on the ground when you were deployed, as this surge was mostly fresh. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about, what was your objective as somebody who was on the ground? And maybe it was pointless, and I'd like to hear how pointless it was. But what exactly were you trying to do at this point in the war?
As I said, it was very depressing, and it sounds almost unbelievable. And this is one of the problems I've had as a whistleblower. It's getting better now because people are beginning to believe, but it was very much the emperor's new clothes. And it was particularly noticeable to someone like myself that did two deployments quite close to each other in 2011 and 2013. And also I was working in the deployment department before I went there. So I saw the various different PowerPoint messages we put out every year. And every year in 2011 and 2013, we had exactly the same message. And that was, to justify the surge. And it was like, we have almost won this war, and one more year we will have done it. We were 80% done. And we said the same message every year. And nobody said, hang on, but you said that in 2007. You said that in 2009. You said it in 2011. Someone must be lying, or we must be doing something wrong. And at first I thought it was incompetence, but I don't think it was now in retrospect. I think it was more sinister than incompetence, that no one bothered to check whether we were really winning. But that was the message that people wanted to hear, because it was good politically, because they could take it back to their countries, back to America, back to Australia, and say, we've almost won this war. And all they needed to do was to take it to the next election, presidential election, Australian election, which is only 3 or 4 years away. And then you get over the line, and as long as you've been saying, a bit like Enron saying we're making profits, even though we're not, and you win the election, and then it's someone else's problem. But that culture of lying and that culture of putting out false messages, the surge didn't work. The surge was just, it was a bit, again, it was like a Ponzi scheme. And we're sending a lot of troops there, and they're all putting out false messages from a lot more different places. Sometimes we killed people. Sometimes we killed, but it's the Australian. We have had some good officers, and one of our chief officers early on, back in 2006, he said, "There's no point us killing Taliban in summer, what they call the fighting season, when there's no snow and people come out to fight long days, and then us retreating over the winter, and then them all coming back again the next summer. We're not achieving anything." And I think that they knew that. This general pointed it out, but they didn't care, because the idea that they were sending Taliban dead in body bags, it made good press. We had a lot of heroes. We had a lot of people given medals, the equivalent of Congressional Medals of Honor, and that was good for politics. That made people, politicians basked in the glory of these heroic characters. As it turned out, some of the heroes were actually mass murderers, and that's coming out now. And the politicians didn't do any due diligence, because they loved to have the story that suited the backdrop to the next election. Here we are fighting terrorism. Here we are being successful. Your taxpayer dollars at work. But in reality, it wasn't working. We were just killing a lot of innocent people. Sometimes we were killing Taliban, but we'd kill one and we'd get 10 more the next year. It has uncanny parallels to the Vietnam War. And it's funny how we looked back on that and like, oh, we'd never do that again. We did it exactly again. And one of the most sinister things about it is the main thing that changed between the Vietnam War and the Afghan War was that we just covered it up better. We learned how to control journalists. We learned that journalists wanted to go into the war zone. So if you got sent into the war zone, it was on the condition that you only really covered the accepted narrative. With things like surges, like General Petraeus did a surge in Iraq. That was the first time that came up. And then, it was followed in Afghanistan by McChrystal. They pushed up to 100,000 troops, which is a lot. And this just made the generals look good. Again, Petraeus, the generals have worked out to get their own PR out there. The surge in Iraq didn't work. But he managed to get a big reputation on it, to say, look what I've done. And it's because, again, like Enron or any kind of Ponzi scheme, they managed to doctor the figures. They managed to say, oh, look, violence is down. People are joining us, but all the figures were made up. If the figures didn't sound good enough, the public relations people would just rewrite them. In fact, that they didn't even check from the beginning. The way that the war was covered by a lot of journalists and by a lot of public relations was just to say, what would sound good? What does victory sound like? And they just write that. There was no fact checking. Nobody ever checked up on them. And everybody just wanted good news. And as I said, that was one of the key reasons why we failed, because we weren't even able to change our tactics, because why would you change tactics if you were winning? Problem was we were losing, but we were saying we were winning, and that left everybody in a difficult situation, because you couldn't say, oh, this year we're going to try something different. And the politicians or public would say, well, why are you trying something different when you're winning? And we didn't have the guts to say, look, we're not winning. We need to try something different, because we were We were caught in our own web of lies because we never told the truth, because everything was done short term. And as a result, we ended up fighting an enemy that didn't exist. We painted the Taliban as this kind of evil Hollywood villain kind of people who are going around beheading people. And it wasn't true. They had popular support. And if anything, we were the villains. We were the Hollywood villains because we were making shit up. We were killing people. We made more people join the Taliban when we were there than were in the Taliban when we first arrived, because they saw us just kill innocent people. They saw us award medals to people who were murderers. And the locals were just like, you guys are completely disreputable. You're completely full of false messages. And people joined the Taliban because of us. And often they fought us because we were there. Had we not even been there, there wouldn't have been an insurgency. But half the reason, and this is why it'd be a big mistake to go back, if we want to get more and more people fighting us, we just need to hang around there, because they attack us because we're in a foreign country and they don't want us there, and they attack us and then we attack them back and then they attack them back. But so it goes on, and it's a mistake. And you get this, and that's why it's so valuable to have people like you. But the mainstream media plays along with a false narrative. Nobody asked any hard questions about Hamid Karzai being, a crook and his brother running opium. And it could have gone a lot better if the media had been a little bit more hard-nosed and said how much of what we are saying is true. Unfortunately, they did a very good smear job. Again, a bit like Julian Assange. They managed to smear the Taliban, not that they were angels, but they managed to paint them that nothing they said was true and everything we said was true. But that wasn't the case. And had the journalists looked into it properly, they would have seen that we weren't making gains. A lot of our people were crooks, pedophiles, murderers, and a lot of money was being stolen. The Afghan people weren't benefiting. And had that truth come out earlier, the war would have been stopped. And it'll be a terrible tragedy if it's managed to be pinned on, well, Biden's head or the Afghans' head, as if George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Petraeus and all these figures didn't have anything to do with it, because they clearly set up the problem. And there's no point blaming the doctor that pronounces someone dead for the murder if 4 other people have been stabbing and shooting at the person, for the previous 20 years. Accountability starts with those who started and propagated the war over that period and didn't actually change anything for the better. It will be interesting to see what happens now, because the mainstream media narrative is very strong. But there will be there was a lot of untruths told over that time. And unless we start facing the truths, things are not going to get better.
I think at this point, as we're having this conversation, well over 100,000 people have left the country. But we saw that ISIS-K, which wasn't there before the U.S. did any of this. I mean, it's a really important point to make, that ISIS isn't just in Afghanistan. It come to Afghanistan because the United States and everyone has this war going on that they can feed off. And but this happened, and we see the Taliban condemn this attack, and they're working with the U.S. military. And I think that's a really tough thing for the Western media to try and digest, because it doesn't make sense. They've been telling us this narrative all along about how these are extraordinarily bad, evil people, and yet they're working with us to evacuate some of their best people potentially from the country. And what I have yet to hear people reckon with is this extraordinary last couple of weeks where an enemy that the United States and coalition forces had been bombing and fighting for the last 10 to 15 years, if not longer, very aggressively, has agreed to stop They're not attacking us. We've lost. They could kill all the forces that are at Kabul airport. They could try and take over the Kabul airport. But they've been working with people to have them evacuate. And I just find that kind of stunning. I'm not sure if there's any other war in history. And Biden almost said this out loud during his press conference after the tragic suicide bombing. But it's really unusual for the enemy you've been attacking to then help you leave the war zone after they've claimed some kind of a victory.
No, I agree. I pointed that out, and it's funny how few of the mainstream media picked that up. There was all this in Australia, like, oh, we've got to get out the evil Taliban, and of course a lot of people want to come to Australia, so they talk up. Some of them probably are in danger, but a lot of them are like, they probably talked it up to get visas. Oh, we're in danger, the Taliban are going to kill us. And then we need to send and we were so badly prepared, we didn't get the evacuation. Our military that takes billions each year were caught totally flat-footed, and we're like, oh, we were going to get around to evacuating people, but now the Taliban have taken over. So that made them look pretty ridiculous. But then it was even funnier, in a really black way, that the Taliban were letting them fly out, even though they controlled the country. They were just letting the planes land and letting the planes take off and saying, see you later. And yet, as you said, we painted them as this bloodthirsty sort of guys that ate people and, covered themselves in blood, and we shot them on sight. And actually, when they took over the country, they were pretty reasonable, and they said, yeah, you can fly out. Foreigners can leave. No problem at all. They kept the airport going. And we still tried to paint this sort of narrative like, oh my God, the Taliban, they're here, they're like aliens. And yet here the planes are landing and they're taking off, and the planes are landing, and presumably the Taliban are running the airport control and making sure that they do go. They didn't let their, they didn't let Afghans just go. But it's ironic. We tried to paint that as bad, but you can't just leave Australia, without the government saying that you can. Particularly now, the flights are all closed. So it's not as if that's out of the ordinary for a country to not let its own citizens just go. And yes, and then when the airport bombing happened, and there was a few strange things about that, because if you look at the timelines from the first warnings, there was a warning at least 10 hours before. So the Taliban probably knew about that, in that either they got the intelligence that ISIS was going to do an attack. They told the Western powers, they said, get away from the airport because you might be attacked. The West did it. The West, told their people not to go near the airport. The attack happened. And now the West and the Taliban, our former terrible, alien-like enemies, we've got to work with them to track down the bombers. They're our partners now in finding these bombers. In fact, I read something interesting in a conservative paper where they pointed out the fact that the Taliban captured a lot of these ISIS-K people, and they just executed them, not the people responsible for the airport bombers before that. And that's pretty ruthless. But it shows you that they're committed to fighting ISIS. Even though ISIS sort of see them as kind of brothers, but they were like, nah, if you're a senior ISIS person, we're executing you, and that's pretty ballsy. And we really, even though we have to eat a lot of humble pie and do a lot of backtracking, we need to acknowledge that they are now our partners in the fight against ISIS. If we're serious, we need to help them. We need to not just help them and not just run away. But instead of just dropping bombs, this is what we should have done in the first place. We need to give them food, because obviously they're going to have terrible problems, famine. They're going to have problems with water. We need to help them with that. Otherwise, it's all very well to say, oh, well, we're on our high horse and we're not going to help these guys. But if we don't help them and it becomes a humanitarian crisis there, what do you think is going to happen? A short-term thing. They don't have any problems with Christianity. I was there when I was in 2000, and the narrative was oh, they hate Christians, they want to kill all. I'm obviously a Christian. It was a group of us. We travelled all around the place. They didn't want to kill us. They actually said they were very disappointed the Americans had abandoned them after fighting the Russians. And they were quite naive, even though most people would have realised that the Americans were only in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s to beat the Russians and give them a bloody nose. And as soon as the Russians had left, the American money left, and the Afghans, Taliban included, were sort of upset about this. And they didn't say, oh, you're Christians. They're like, well, we thought that you were our brothers in this great struggle, and we thought that you were going to hang around and help us. We're disappointed that you've left. And there was the narrative that people want to beat up is it's some sort of Islamic Christian war of the worlds, but it wasn't the case. They wanted food, they wanted medicine, they wanted help, and they didn't care. They're more interested in Afghanistan and their sort of their national pride, but they don't see us as enemies simply because we're not Muslim. They see us enemies because of our double dealing, and but if we were there, the best thing for us to do, it won't happen, of course, is for us to apologise for our mistakes and to start working with them to say, okay, you are now the de facto government. And that means not sponsoring people like the Northern Alliance or not sponsoring any kind of, rebel groups. But whether we like it or not, they are the de facto government. We do support de facto governments. We just shouldn't go around sponsoring rebel groups because rebel groups only cause misery for the average person. But bomb attacks, the last thing they need is a civil war. They do have enough popular support. I mean, they might only have 40% or something, but so does Joe Biden. So does our Prime Minister. You can't depose somebody because they don't have the full support of everyone in the country. They have enough support to be the legitimate government, and therefore we shouldn't work with any rebel groups, and we should help them, because what Afghanistan needs now is peace. We talk about, rights for women, and again, one of these lies, it won't help women if we start a civil war. Women want to survive like men. The human right they really want is not to go to school, but not to be raped and killed. Civil war will make that happen. What we need now is some sort of stability in Afghanistan. It doesn't matter if it's a relatively hardline Islamic state. Again, one of the Western narratives is like we need to bring back miniskirts from the 70s. No, we don't. We need to stop the war. We need to stop dropping bombs. We need to give them water. We seem to be able to do business with Saudi Arabia, which is run on hardline Muslim, where they have to wear burqas, etc. We don't have any problems with that. Funnily enough, it's probably because of the money. So we need to be able to say to the Afghans, if you want to have a religious state, that's fine. But we will help you to have a stable religious state. And funnily enough, it's a bit like the Berlin Wall falling. The best form of attraction is promotion, in the sense that the best form of promotion, if they want what we have, eventually they will change themselves. But us trying to force them to become a mirror image of ourselves when they're not ready to is a mistake. And we need to help them. It would make me so happy to see us eating a humble pie and say, look, they're the government. Whatever happened in the past is the past. We apologise for it. We want to move forward now so you can produce some stability in the region. The great irony is that if they did that, in 20 years' time, the Americans may have what they always wanted, a secure base and a secure ally in the area, but by being conciliatory towards the Taliban rather than trying to bomb them out of existence. And so they could achieve everything. It involves maybe losing a little bit of face, but as they say, you can't save your face and your ass at the same time. And you've got to choose one. And going back, pushing the region back into war because you're still trying to make the Taliban look bad is going to be a mistake.
Let's end with the issue of accountability, and obviously the most important issue in the aftermath of this war. But you've already in Australia have a head start with a staged, managed government inquiry into the war crimes committed by, if I understand correctly, mostly lower level soldiers are the ones that have been implicated or singled out the most for their conduct. It's much like what happens in the US military. The people who get court martialed for war crimes are the lower level US soldiers. Obviously, the generals are never taken to task for the orders that they have given. I really haven't seen anything like that since the Vietnam War and Ron Ridenhour and things of that nature. But let me ask you about the recent story that was put out by the Australia Broadcasting Corporation about Captain Louise, because
Yes.
I'd like to know. I think seems like a really important story. I'd like to know what this. So, just so people who are listening or watching probably have no idea what I'm talking about at this moment. So I'll just quickly say, and then you can fill in the additional details, that the Brereton Inquiry had a witness named Captain Louise who was attacked. They had their home bombed. You can describe more details, but apparently this wasn't reported. It was kept secret because the person who was attacked was relocated. And anyways, they had a partner who had observed and witnessed a war crime. You can add and fill in some of the additional details, but what's the significance of this, that somebody who has cooperated with the war crimes inquiry was attacked in this way?
Yeah, it's a big deal. I was as surprised as anybody by that story that came out last week. She was like me. She was someone who was attached to the Special Forces, and she had a partner in the Special Forces who at the time, I think she's got a different partner now, but he came back. I think they were in Afghanistan at the time. And he said, we were out on patrol. We shot someone by mistake, and we all kind of panicked. There was a group of 11 farmers. Some were just kids, onion farmers. And then we didn't want any witnesses, so we shot all 11 of them, buried them and said they were Taliban. So pretty bad. One of the worst things that kind of happened in our space. Anyway, she gave evidence about this to say, this is what the guy told me. And it's been backed up by other records as well. So it's not fantasy. The records show on the particular day that 11 people were killed in what now seems very suspicious circumstances. And she gave evidence to the war crimes inquiry to say that someone told her after it happened that it had happened, which of course gives a much more weight to just looking at facts and figures. And then, she got some sort of bomb attack. I was probably knowing from the description, it sounds like it was like a stun grenade, a grenade that Special Forces use when they're doing bursting into houses in order to do hostage rescue. And they have these grenades that don't have shrapnel, but give off a sort of explosive blast. And it's dangerous, and it blew all the windows in of her house her new house when she was asleep. And it wasn't designed to kill her, but it was definitely designed to intimidate and scare her, to say, you give evidence against us and, bad things are going to happen. And obviously it was a warning. I've had a similar warning. I've got two daughters, and I got veiled threats to say, everything that you hold dear could be taken away from you. They know I'm pretty nuts and it's not going to worry me too much, but obviously everybody's got a weakness, and the idea that my daughters would be harmed because I'm giving evidence against certain people. Yeah, it's pretty scary. So Captain Louise, she got moved to a new premises, and I'm glad that she, just like me, she said it makes me more determined to do what's right. So I've got a lot of respect for her. I don't know whether I know her. That's obviously an assumed name. We've probably crossed paths because we were there about the same time. So good on her. And yes, this is, when you started off to say, one of the big problems is it's all going to be hung around the necks of a few very low down people. I don't know that there ever will be any actual criminal trials, because the higher ups run the trials, and they know that if someone gets convicted, that someone, especially if they've had a lot of medals, and most people on trial are very, very sort of famous soldiers, there'll be a lot of questions to say, how come you didn't know this guy who won the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, not just once, but twice? How come you didn't know? And it'll come out more and more that people actually because a lot of these witnesses said, I made a complaint about this guy in 2006, in 2009, in 2011. So people will start asking questions. How could the generals not know? How did the colonels not know when people made complaints? And this is one of my important points. We do need to put corporals who murdered people in jail, absolutely. But we also need to look at who knew, and if they didn't know, why the hell didn't they? Well, one of the big principles of international law of war crimes is if you either knew or you should have known as a leader, you're guilty. After the Second World War, we hung a senior Japanese general for war crimes committed by his troops, even though there was no proof that he knew anything about them or even ordered them. But we just said, you should have known. And we hung him. Now, we don't apply that same principle to ourselves. And I think the generals may be innocent, but they definitely need to answer some questions under oath, under cross-examination, to find out whether they really did know nothing. And I think when the soldiers get convicted, they could rightly say, I was a bit like My Lai massacre. They'll be saying, well, I was actually following my orders, or everybody knew what I was doing. I was carrying out a reign of terror, but it's what my bosses wanted me to do. And hell, they gave me 10 medals. You reckon that might have shown that they were happy. And one of the problems was people who complained about the heroes, in inverted commas, they were the ones that often, like me, they were the ones that got punished. They were the ones that got ostracized. It's pretty ironic when I was one of the leading voices to say everything is bullshit in this war. Our heroes are bullshit. Our villains are bullshit. Our progress is bullshit. I'm the one that's on trial. Now, that's suspicious, that it's not some sort of a cover-up. And the same that people who came forward about war criminals early on, often they were the ones that were ostracized because the government and the leaders didn't want to know that their heroes that were bringing in all the sort of secondhand glory might be implicated, because they knew if the big heroes went down, some of the generals might not go down. Not that they particularly cared about anybody, but they cared about themselves. And that's pretty disgusting. I want to make sure that doesn't happen. And most soldiers are the same, to say, if soldiers are going to be punished, and many of them deserve to be, or some of them, generals need to be punished too. You know, at best, it was extreme incompetence, that they had no idea what was going on their watch. And if we don't punish extreme incompetence from senior leaders, we're only going to get extremely incompetent leaders. And we need to start making people accountable. We only have to put one general on trial, one politician on trial, and the rest will follow suit. But if we don't put one on trial, we are setting ourselves up for failure in the next war.
We really need to listen to people like yourself and others who were the dissenters along the way during this war. I mean, that's the thing I really want to impress to people. You know, we've had Matthew Ho, who I know you're familiar with, on our show. He'll actually be returning next week to have a follow-up discussion. And right now, Daniel Hale, a whistleblower, was sent to prison, exposed what U.S. drones were doing in Afghanistan, who was being killed by this form of remote control warfare that was embraced so aggressively by Barack Obama and his administration. And I think we really need to listen to people who were trying to warn us. It's easier said than done because in the media, who dominates are these figures that are entirely discredited at this point, like David Petraeus, Henry Kissinger. We shouldn't be hearing from Henry Kissinger. You've got people who were involved in the Iraq War who are giving their opinions on the Afghanistan war. It's so absurd, but we really should be listening and trying to seek out. I guess I tell people who are watching the show, try to seek out these voices who have been challenging the war.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I'll give a cross plug to Russell Brand, who did a very good thing recently, saying that so many of these talking heads that we get out, Condoleezza Rice, people like that, the media says, oh, well, she used to be Secretary of State. And they forget to say she now works for some sort of think tank, which is a thinly disguised arms dealing organization or whatever. And of course, they want to go back, or they want to pin faults a certain way, but they're all, and they're allowed to have an opinion, but they need to declare that they now work for McDonnell Douglas or Boeing or etc. And and people like me are far more credible because I don't work for anybody. I work for what is right. And it isn't easy to get fairness. And that's one of the things about going to trial. And that's why it's important. And that's why I don't want them to drop the charges particularly, because being a defendant in a trial, as I've said from the beginning, I don't see myself as on trial. I see myself as putting the government on trial. And I get to say why I did what I did. I get to say it was because I could see the whole war was bullshit. And I get the chance to do that in a courtroom where the judge is listening and all the spin is stripped away. And that's a really big advantage. So going to trial is good. And I'm big admirer of Daniel Hale. I think he's a real hero. And I love the way he said, yeah, put me in jail. I'm not going to take a backward step. What I did was right. I love that. And I would call upon all the veterans, everyone involved with the war, who, and you're in a good position, because we all get tired, but just come forward and say, if you knew it was bullshit, and we all did, come forward, because even though we're sick of hearing it, as they say in politics, when you're sick of saying it, a lot of people are hearing it for the first time. So everybody come out and say, it was bullshit. We were killing people. We were covering it up. We knew it wasn't working. And the more people that come out and say that, the more likely the average person, because it's not about us trying to put down America or the military. We are trying to protect the average person who pays taxes and whose sons or daughters are killed in stupid wars like this. We're sticking up for them, as you guys did in the Vietnam War, because at the end of the day, it's everyday Americans and Australians and Brits that suffer in these wars, and let alone the Afghans. And we need to hold the rich people, the politicians to account. And one way is to expose that it was bullshit, because the average person will get that. It's not an impossible. In Vietnam, they got it. The war was stopped from people power, and people began to see that the narrative was bullshit. And if everybody who knew and said something can come out now, it would really help. So I'm calling upon veterans to say they knew, and the more people that come out and say they knew, it'll put the politicians in a tough position to say, how come you didn't know when everyone else did?
David, if you wanted to let people know your Twitter handle and where people can find you and follow you, I know you've been doing some good commentary on Afghanistan. So you can give your Twitter handle or anything people might want to find. Do you want to share your GoFundMe too? So people can
I've got a Twitter handle. It's called Murdoch Cadell. And it's, you'll see it about, I'd love followers. It always makes it good that people listen to what you're saying. And I've got a GoFundMe, which is called 50 Years in Jail for Whistleblowing on the ADF. I'm grateful for any donation. It makes me feel good, just even if you've got $5, that all helps. It's for my legal costs, and eventually I might be using some of it to put out the message, because a lot of it is done. The more people know the truth, the more we can get done. I'm very grateful to you, Kevin. You do great work on the. I've seen you for doing Julian Assange's work, and we need people like you more than ever, because it's what's amazing. Had the truth got out earlier, in the mainstream media, this is one of the unfortunate differences between, say, the Afghanistan papers that you talked about, the Pentagon papers in the 70s. The mainstream media, and it's even more bizarre because Catherine Graham, who owned the Washington Post, was part of the establishment, but they did put out the story, and they did hit that story pretty hard. That's not happening at the moment. And if the truth had been known, if the truth was known about Julian Assange, if the truth was known about me, whatever, the war would have been stopped if the more media did it. And so you guys are so important. And if it wasn't for people like you, if I didn't have any coverage at all, I don't know whether I'd still be alive. It's very hard without support. So I'm very grateful to you and people like you.
Once again, here's a reminder to support the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast by going to our Patreon or Rockfin, or finding us on Spotify. On Patreon, we're at patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. On Rockfin, you can subscribe to our channel at rockfin.com/unauthorized dis. And on Spotify, all you have to do is find our show, Unauthorized Disclosure, and become a paid subscriber to our Spotify. So thank you for supporting the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. We'll be back soon.